rarely seen police officers as young as the two opposite me. They lacked the authoritative confidence one would normally expect during questioning of a missing child's case. The questions, too, were meandering and unfocused, as though the officers really didn't know what they were actually trying to achieve or elicit from me. My guess was that they were junior dogs' bodies who had been lumped with the dull task of closing off a dead-end lead. When a child goes missing, every lead needs to be chased, if only to protect the force against accusations of neglect if the search fails. But Jake was a troubled kid, and I knew he'd been caught dealing weed to other pupils. I imagined that the officer in charge of the case had a stack of leads that provided far more plausible explanations as to why a kid with links to the local low-level drug dealers might mysteriously go missing in the night. He wasn't going to waste his best officers chasing down a science teacher using strange noises to fill a room with ghosts. These officers were here on a glorified admin mission. I could see the resentment in their eyes. But for their lack of experience and motivation, they were diligent nonetheless. They wanted more details about the nature of infrasound and what it could mean in the context of Jake's text. So we discussed it in some detail. I delivered a mini-science lesson in the nature of low-frequency wave energy, natural resonance, and how the retina could be fooled into seeing things that weren't there. Describing it was almost therapeutic given everything that had just happened. As I'd felt my grasp on reality slipping, it was good to go over the simple, rational explanation for it to help regain my grip. I answered all their questions about Jake. Apparently all they found on Jake's home computer was a few articles about shadow people and ghosts, as well as a few research articles on unrelated medical procedures. They wanted to know if the two could be linked, but I explained that Jake's mom was a nurse in a nearby hospital. If anyone was searching for methicillin-resistant staph, auroris treatments, or subcranial hematomas, or phacoemulsification techniques, then it was probably her. Shadow people and U-porn, though? That sounded more like Jake. Eventually, they had no further questions. Though their theories were obviously not something I was supposed to be privy to, their relative greenness as officers meant they let slip more than they should when exchanging tidbits. From what I could gather, they thought that my experiment had probably spooked him, leading to a sleepless night. In his insomnia, he'd probably tried to sneak out to visit a girlfriend, but had fallen afoul to one of his less amiable contacts en route. There was an implication that, even at 15, Jake already owed some serious people money. The officers had what they needed to close this lead. I was thanked for my help, and they left. Richard seemed visibly relieved when I explained to him everything we'd talked about. He'd clearly been driving himself crazy thinking that the cops were investigating a case of neglect at the school, and that he was going to be facing legal action over inappropriate experiments being conducted in the classroom. However, although the panic had faded, his anger had not. "Clean up this mess. Now. Talk to all your students from yesterday. Find out if any of them are still having problems, and fix it. Make sure there's nothing to worry about. If I get so much as a report of a broken night's sleep from one of the parents, you're finished." I sent messages out to all the students and asked them to come see me as soon as possible, as Richard had agreed to cover the rest of my day's classes. I interviewed them one by one, asking what they'd seen since the experiment. Most told stories about occasional glimpses of something in the dark. One told me that he was so scared that he hadn't been able to do any of his homework. Nice try, I thought, but I kept my solemn face on. However, most had been able to nod off eventually, and few complained of anything further stretching into the daytime. In fact, when really pushed, most seemed to agree that anything they'd seen was just their imagination going into overdrive. Secretly, I had my doubts as to how many of their visions truly were imaginary, but the calmer they were, the less they were affected, and if they truly did see fewer shadows, the less they believed, then I was going to let them carry on and watch the problem solve itself. The end of the day came, and I looked over the register of the class to see who I'd managed to talk to. I'd managed to tick off everyone bar 2, Jake and Amy. I hadn't seen Amy all day since she approached me after the lesson. I hurried to the admin department to report it, but Amy had apparently been picked up by her father earlier that morning, claiming to be suffering from a massive headache. I breathed a sigh of relief. I could talk to her tomorrow, and hopefully another night's sleep would put the whole thing to bed. With Amy safe at home, the day over, and Jake still nowhere to be found, I went back to my place. I poured myself a whiskey and stood at my window, watching the sun go down over the city horizon. It was normally a beautiful sight. This view was one of the principal reasons I paid so much for this flat, but today it held no such pleasure. The sun got lower, and I watched as the tall building's shadows elongated into the evening. There was something about the way the shadows were creeping across the streets and over the hedges and walls towards my windows that set my heart racing. Of course, it was just the angle of the sun, but for all the panic of the last 2 days, it was difficult not to feel an almost predatory feel to their approach. The way the shadows snaked through the trees and poured through my windows, the way the black imprints of the lamp posts and power lines created long, grasping fingers that crawled up into my room. Soon the whole city seemed to be cloaked in a dusky twilight, and every shadow seemed to writhe and pulsate. The wind blew the trees, and the shadows swayed on my walls like a cobra waiting to strike. I downed the whiskey and threw on all the lights for comfort, but there was no comfort to be had. The harsh, bright lights just turned my flat into a patchwork of shadows. Behind the couch, behind the TV, over the cupboards, and anywhere that the bright central light couldn't reach, was suddenly turned into a pool of darkness. A darkness that stared and watched and waited and mocked. A darkness that demanded to hold my gaze, just so that it could gaze right back at me. I poured another whiskey, bringing it to my mouth and taking a deep swig, when, through the distorting lens of the bottom of the glass, I saw a blurry, dark figure standing in front of me. I was paralyzed. The whiskey slopped against my teeth and burned my tongue, but I didn't dare swallow. I didn't dare move. I just watched as the shadowy figure towered, motionless, begging me to react. An eternity passed in between the poundings of my heart. The vapor of the whiskey almost tickled my nostrils, and in that moment of lapsed concentration the shadowy figure charged at me. I screamed and flailed, sending my glass shattering against the nearby wall. But then, nothing. In the instant our gaze had broken, the figure was gone. I stood, panting and breathless, my heart beating so loudly I couldn't hear. I was sweating burnt adrenaline and shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. I brought my hand up, and, grabbing a handful of hair, I collapsed backwards against the cupboard and slid to the floor. If not believing was the key to not seeing these things, then I was doomed forever. Gavra was right. He must have been. These ghosts were already here. I just let them out. But what did they want? I don't know how long I sat there for. It felt like hours. Soon, though, I found my composure and found the courage to stand up. I poured another whiskey. But the shadows were still there. In every alcove and nook and cranny of furniture there was another drake of shadows waiting to pounce. I had to get out of that place right then. I wandered the streets until I found an internet cafe that was open until late. Better still, they too had whiskey. I wasn't really paying attention to what I was doing, just blind, meaningless surfing of anything that came to mind. Given the evening I'd had, pictures of kittens were a central theme. However, through my aimless Googling, one particular result page came up. Result 1, as usual, was a wiki article. I figured there was no harm in reading it in case anyone ever asked, so I clicked it. I felt my stomach lurch and my heart sink. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. I knew where Jake was. I just hoped I was in time.